want to go ahead and first of all acknowledge that this is a collaboration with Zonta Club of Newport Harbor. And Sheila Cook-Cohen has been terrific in stepping up and looking to co-sponsor these events with United Nations Association Orange County Chapter. We're looking forward to a very full and productive set of coffee talks this coming year. And so this is really our first, during sort of in the COVID period, one of our first in the collaboration to work together on a range of important topics. So Sheila, great to have you as a partner, and thank you so much. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Isabel Triddle, who is the president of our United Nations Association Orange County Chapter. Isabel.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Isabel Triddle, and I am currently the president of the United Nations Association's Orange County. As Dave said, we're really excited about this type of collaboration that we're having with our coffee talk. I'm having like a little of noise, and I think I need to stop here because I'm also with my daughter. So again, welcome you, all of you, and then I need to step for a second for my daughter.
Okay, we know what that's like, having kids in the household and dealing with that. We're honored to have speaking to us today, and I know Sheila, I believe you're going to do the introductions here
yes.
for Sandy, and why don't you go ahead and just give us a little bit on Zonta and a little background, and then go ahead with the introduction and we can begin.
Yep, happy to do, and I won't take a long time in doing it. For individuals that are not familiar with Zonta, the word is a little bit strange in that it comes from the Lakota Indians. They were Sioux Indians, and that's the origin of the word. It just means honest and trustworthy. And I think our founders of Zonta decided, okay, we are honest and trustworthy, and actually we are. So just some stats about Zonta. We are a worldwide organization. We have 63 members around the world, all volunteers, although we do have a small paid staff that is based in Chicago. We are 100 years old. I think it was just last year. I mean, that's a long time. And we continue to get more members as the years go by. And I think it's great because once you get involved with Zonta, you find a purpose maybe that people are looking for. In California, we have just 22 locations. That's not too bad, but we're a big state. The whole purpose of Zonta, for those who may not know, is that we're looking to support and make change to the negativity that goes on and is impacting women around the world, not just in California. I think you know what those items are. How about abuse, child marriage, ERA? Those are the items that we focus on. We are an active member of the UN, who is the parent for UNA. And we, with UNA, are, as Dave said, we're developing a collaborative effort. And we have 4 of these coffee talks scheduled over the course of the year, along with whatever else might arise. Our joint purpose is to continue not only our own collaborative effort, but to expand it. And right now I'm talking to 2 other Zonta organizations, Dave, and then we'll be bringing in your teams as well. We're very appreciative of everybody's time and effort to just stop on a Saturday morning. Well, for a few people, it's not Saturday morning anymore, but to have a cup of coffee with us. The people we reach out to and learn from, the more effective Zonta can be. So that would be it for now. If you want me to go ahead and introduce Sandy, I'm more than happy to do so. Sandy, are you ready?
I am ready when you are.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. All right, so I'll give a very brief background on Sandy, because from what I know of her and have read about her, it could be a very long introduction. Just in terms of her CV, She's a medical practitioner. She's an educator, a university director, and was recently appointed by President Trump to the how do I get this right, Sandy? Public-Private Partnership Advisory Council to End Human Trafficking.
Yeah, quite a title.
I know. Hopefully you can put that into an acronym of some sort. The first time I heard a word that was of much interest to me was the first time I met with Sandy, and she said, CSEC. We really need to do something about CSEC. Well, I had only been with Zonta maybe a couple of months. Actually, Lisa Kane and I had met her. So it means, just in case she speaks about it, and I hope she will, commercial exploitation of children is CSEC. And we haven't yet in Zonta begun to work into that, Sandy, but we're seeing more and more issues arise now with children, girls and boys. I just finished your podcast on the boys. Very interesting, extremely good. So from there, Sandy, please just take over, and we are all very interested in listening to you.
All right. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen and make sure everybody can see my PowerPoint now. Can you see it, everybody? Just thumbs up or nod.
Yes,
Dave,
I
thank
can
you.
see it. Yeah, we're good.
All right. So I have 30 minutes and then 15 minutes for questions. And so I took a 120 slide point because the question I'm supposed to answer today is, how do we combat violence against women? And I reduced that to 55 slides. So if anybody's into math, you know that this is going to go very quickly because 55 slides in 30 minutes is pretty quick. But I do feel, especially because we're international, we all have different language skills and bases. And so the visual with the verbal is usually an advantage. I've lived in several other countries, speak Greek, German, and Spanish, a little Japanese, and so on. And it always helps me. So keeping in mind that international access point, that's kind of why I have slides. I know some people are really moving away from slides, but they help me. With regard to the human trafficking piece, I'm not going to address that today, Sheila. I'm sorry. Although I do want you to know 71% of human trafficking, both sexual exploitation and labor trafficking, 71% are women. And so it's very intertwined with the root causes of violence against women that we're going to address today. And kind of to get ahead of the game instead of at the end, because I want to call to action, I do want to give you some information. Maybe this would be like my elevator speech right now. The Global Center is now 17 years old at Vanguard University, and it oversees a minor. We host an annual conference called Ensure Justice every year, just like everybody else. In March, it's going to be virtual instead of in person, which actually gives broader access to everyone. And this year, our theme is being crushed. And I think you can probably understand where that concept leads to vulnerability and violence, abuse, and exploitation, which is often identified as human trafficking. The podcast that Sheila mentioned, we've been doing the Ending Human Trafficking podcast since 2011, 2 each year, and we have listeners in over 130 countries. We want to educate people on what the issues are. And our mantra is study the issues, be a voice, make a difference. If you don't do your homework, you might actually say the wrong thing and actually cause harm. So we want people to be educated and informed. And I'm really proud of our Women in Justice minor. And I feel like having an interdisciplinary program at a small private university is a real step forward internationally as well as locally. So what I decided that I wanted to do today is to use my work as an example of how we as a community can combat violence against women. I am not here to give you statistics about violence against women. A Google search literally has tens of millions of hits on violence against women. I'm sure every one of you has some experience with presentations or work that you yourself have done on violence against women. I remember years ago interviewing a journalist from Lagos, Nigeria, who told me that the harmful traditional practices were so ingrained in the culture that outside organizations with good intentions, remember, study the issues, be a voice, make a difference. You have to do your homework first. They came in, they built a beautiful brand new OBGYN hospital for the women. And then they thought this would solve the problem of perinatal health. And it did not, because the education at the community level did not include the men. So consequently, the men didn't allow their wives to go to the beautiful hospital. And so yes, because of birth complications and infant neonatal and death didn't change significantly by building a hospital. So those are some of the things I want us to think about. I did my doctoral work by researching building capacity for women in post-conflict Iraq. This is the cover I created for my dissertation. And it was, I went back to academia much later in life. I'm a nurse. I worked in pediatrics, and so this was a whole new avenue for me. When I started my research, I had this picture here is like from my life here in Orange County, California, and from my first trip over on the right. My first trip to Iraq, these are all widows whose husbands had all been taken during the night by Saddam Hussein in a train, taken to South Iraq and executed. And that village, I went to visit it, and I talked to a woman in her 40s who was very intelligent, well educated, and she said, because there were no fathers, because there were no brothers, I never married. And I didn't have any way to relate to that. This third picture is from the Congo, and rape as a weapon of war. I didn't have any concept for that. This second picture, people who, women who are in labor trafficking. We so often hear about sex trafficking, but women are also overrepresented in forced labor. One woman in Pakistan whose husband died, but she's still responsible for the generational debt. The owner of the brick kiln came to her and said, well, your children are very young, so all the three that can work, which were from 7 to 13, they will all have to work. The baby was, of course, too young. Or you can pay your debt with one of your kidneys. And then she nearly died from post-op complications by paying to free her children by having to give up a kidney. And then CSEC, and I did want to mention it, Sorry there, I went too fast. This is a young girl who was killed by the people that exploited her in commercial sexual exploitation of children. And definitely, I'd love to help you all get more educated on human trafficking issues. So you might want to think about the Ensure Justice Conference and listening to the podcast. But what I want to talk about today is a strategy that is foundational to combating violence against women. We cannot do this without the men. Patriarchy, as anyone who has studied violence against women, we see the role that men play in that and the cultural structures that are part of a patriarchal or patrilineal society. And I'm particularly interested in the role of faith in that approach as well, because sometimes I feel like we're making more progress in some parts of the world than in other. And when I explored this in my work in Iraq, I worked a great deal with the faith community there, Muslim predominantly. I've also worked with a lot of other communities. And one of the quotes from the book I mentioned earlier, Scars Across Humanity, Elaine Storkey, a wonderful Dr. Elaine Storkey, sociologist from the UK, says it's both more subtle and more powerful than in the secular arena because it can be seen as speaking for God. And I always have kept those two arenas separate, faith over here, secular over here. But then when I go into work in a community, I begin to find that much of the many of the issues that women are faced with are often based on, I'll let you mute your mic. Dave, do you want to mute everybody and then I'll unmute myself? Okay, there you go. Shame-based culture often comes out of some religious context. And shame-based culture is not just in places like where I worked in northern Iraq, but it also happens right here in California. And I pulled some slides from some trauma trainings that I did years ago. And there is a traumagenic dynamic model that Finkelhor and Brown developed. And one of the most significant parts of that, and I'm not going to bring that into this 30-minute presentation, but one of it is what shame looks like. And we often don't understand how to identify that shame that actually becomes an oppression that is stronger on the female in the community. And it often looks like things that we easily pick out. We know that young people who have had child sexual abuse histories often self-medicate, and they have this sense of I'm bad. And so drugs, promiscuity, all of that acting out. And in many of our workshops and things that we do on that, we focus on that. But the other way that shame appears is to prove that I'm not bad. And there's the perfectionist and the workaholic and no sense of being able to have any failure. And when I worked with young people as a pediatric nurse, I began to identify that. And I took that knowledge base with me when I started working in Iraq. And I met woman after woman after woman who was a perfectionist, a workaholic, no failure allowed. And I began to understand that in that shame-based culture, that kind of dishonor impacted the entire family, the father, the uncle, the brothers, and it led to a tradition of honor killings. And legislation had already been passed the first time I went to Iraq in 2009, and I was meeting with some female law enforcement folks who I had been given a report of how that new law had impacted locally. And yet these women wanted to talk to me out in the hallway, not in the conference room. And they wanted me to understand that even though we passed a law, there were still honor killings happening. And so we had to find ways to bring new ideas into the culture. And one of my professor friends who came to visit me for workshops and leadership training in Costa Mesa, California, really helped me understand how a lot of what I had said at the beginning just went into the wind, so to speak, because there was no category for including that. So we had to start creating ideas for new ways of thinking. And I watched, how many of you know March 8th is International Women's Day? Raise your hand, put your clickers on. Good job. I celebrate that every year. And it's about empowerment. And I listened to speeches one year back in 2010. I heard Hillary Clinton say the word empowerment 11 times in an 8-minute speech. But when I started looking at what empowerment looked like, lots of times it ended up in a victim blaming situation, because the idea that we created education for girls and then their parents wouldn't let them go to school. Well, here's my pyramid for, and I was very influenced by Kabir. And this idea of empowerment being opportunity is really a tiny little piece of this. You can have opportunity. There is school available in Pakistan, but if you're the elder daughter and you have to take care of the flock, that's the livelihood for the family. So you don't actually have access to that opportunity. You can't actually achieve an education. The father in that family may very much want his daughter to go to school, but he also has 4 other children to feed. And this is part of the family income, to have these herds. And shepherding is part of that job. So we have to ask deeper questions about how educational opportunities combat violence against women. I began in 2009 working with women in higher education, first with the University of Duhok, and eventually with the my apologies, with the Ministry of Higher Education. And this is one of my favorite pictures of international travel pre-COVID. Being in Baghdad with women, 25 women from 18 higher education institutions, 18 universities, and helping women in higher education not only talk about empowerment, not only see the opportunities, but actually having the skills to achieve it, learning how to have access. And when I first started going to Iraq, people talk to me a lot about safety, and I said, well, my kids are raised and I'm a grandma, so it doesn't matter. But we do need courage. We need courage because we have to do the hard work. We can't just do a workshop. We can't build a hospital and say, well, they didn't use it. We have to do the deep work. And sometimes that is a little scary. And we face a lot of roadblocks. We face a lot of roadblocks, often because of the persistence of patriarchy. Dave, you inspire me because you're here today. And I was afraid this was all going to be women. And it's okay to do things with just women. I do it a lot. But I want men to show up as well, because to combat violence against women, men have to be part of the conversation. We have to figure out how to break down patriarchy, not just in Iraq because of honor killings, but right here in Orange County, California. And I'm going to talk quickly about one of the projects that I've done. We have to think both and, men and women. I have hosted male leaders from other countries. So in this picture, you actually see one of my students here, and a young man from South Sudan who did a community solutions internship fellowship at Vanguard Global Center for Women and Justice, helping young men in South Sudan begin to understand how to be a voice for women. And he was, by the time his 4 months was up, we did a debrief exit interview, and English is his second language. But one of the things he told me that impacted me so much, he said, Dr. Sandy, when I go back, I'm going to speak to the chiefs about what I learned from the elderly woman at Vanguard University. And it was the very first time anybody called me elderly, but I loved it because it showed how he was taking knowledge about working with women back to the village leaders. And his message to them was and he did a presentation, he prepared it before he left, but his message was based on this. It is a better return on your investment to educate your daughter than to sell her for 50 cows. I at first thought he was talking about some historical reference, but what was happening right then was daughters were being sold because the family needed the 50 cows, the bride price. We have to change, and they're going to listen to this young man more than they're going to listen to this old lady. I was invited to speak to the Ecumenical Patriarchs Forum on human trafficking. And I spoke about widows. Remember those widows? Their daughters had no future. That's where we need to enlist the patriarchs in our religious institutions as well. We brought I'm very pleased to be on this UN coffee talk as well as with Zonta, because here's a trainer from the UNODC, my friend, Takis Papadopoulou, and a Syrian who is working with refugees and how we can help women who are particularly vulnerable in the refugee community by empowering men to be part of helping them. This, if you take nothing else away from today, please don't think in either or dichotomies. Think both and. It takes men and women to combat violence against women. Otherwise, you'll build a hospital for the women and the husbands won't let the women go to the hospital. So the rest of this, most of the rest of this presentation, I want to answer the why. I want to answer the why, because if we don't empower women with access to the opportunities, with agency, with resources, they won't engage. And answering the why is important for government officials, the people that make the policy. I've studied Wilberforce quite a bit, and he built networks of elites, academics, faith leaders, and government officials and legislators. And in order to get the top-down laws passed, you have to make sure that the leadership understands why it's valuable for them. So one of the strategies that we had working in Iraq was to actually demonstrate how when women have more presence, everybody thrives. And in 2014, the UN secretary said that when women are at the table, peace treaties are more durable. Children are educated. So we cultivate those support networks for women in higher education. And then we begin to see changes locally. So imagine the first time I taught at University of Duhok, they had to force them, but they actually had young men come to my lecture. They didn't force them, but they made it part of the requirements for the course they were taking. But after a few years of that, we began to see those young men changed their attitudes. So when women are professors in the university, that's going to impact the students who graduate from that university. That's combating violence against women by changing the way young men think, not just changing the way young women think. How do we start doing that more? We have to cultivate women leaders. It's like planting a garden. You don't just suddenly say, okay, women can be Congress people, they can be legislators, they can be in parliament. The first time I went to parliament in 2009 in the Kurdistan region, they were very proud to set up a meeting for me with the Women's Caucus, 2009, because based on UN protocols, they had changed their dynamics so that women had to be 30%, or they were striving for 30% of parliament. So now there are 10 women elected. And I went to meet with them. They're brand new. And there was a big round table. And at the foot was a man, and at the head was a man. And then the women were on the side. And so even though they were in parliament, they didn't have the skill set. They didn't know the process. They hadn't studied political science. And so they were being treated with less dignity, not because they were women as much as it was because they didn't know the process. So if we're going to be successful, we have to prepare people to be successful. We have to create space for them. We have to provide support networks and feed the new plants. That means, and this is always interesting for presidents of universities, but those 18 universities with 25 women in the newly formed network that we put together, they had to actually create a budget. And for that culture, that meant a budget for food, because you can't have a meeting without food. I know we can in COVID-19, but you can't really. Can anybody do a meeting? I've been to lots of Zonta meetings and I've been to the UN. Everybody feeds us and gives us coffee and tea. Actually, the tea in Iraq is my favorite. So to do this, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can keep on keeping on by using what other people have already done. There are so many resources. And if you're interested in some of the resources that I have available, please let me know, put it in the chat, and I'll send you some links. When we had a higher education roundtable, one of the most important things we identified is the lack of relevant experience, like the women in Parliament. So to combat violence against women at a legislative level, we need to make sure that women have the relevant experience in that field. And when we ask women to be leaders, we have to be intentional about identifying potential leaders, keeping them in the pipeline, developing their leadership skills. One of the things that the Deputy Minister of Higher Education in Baghdad asked me to do when I came to Baghdad to do a week-long seminar is to teach the leaders, the women, how to manage conflict. Well, that wasn't, I wanted to teach on empowerment, but he said, no, what happens is when they go into a meeting and men say no, they don't know how to counter in a professional way with conflict management skills. Well, you know, I've studied conflict management. So we did development in leadership around conflict management. That's an amazing tool in combating violence against women. Creating opportunities for encouragement, because when you go to a meeting, and it still happens, let me tell you, here in California, and I try to say something and nobody gives me a chance, I finally start to say something, and then people talk over me because I live in a patriarchal society. Connection. We need to have networks that do those things, that develop and encourage and build leadership skills. Understanding that there are unseen barriers. There's lots of resources to help with overcoming the gender bias in leadership opportunities. Second generation gender bias means that I love the Gina Davis See Jane campaign. Women don't try to do things. Little girls don't plan to become president, don't plan to become prime minister, don't plan to become the faith leader or the professor, because they didn't grow up seeing that. So how do we begin to create more role models, take the barriers out of career paths, and create access to networks, Baseline, people become leaders iteratively. They increasingly have challenging roles. They learn from mentors, they experiment, they go back, they repeat the process. Research shows, though, that it's much more difficult for men because of those subtle biases. And we have to be persistent and be to overcome those biases. One example is when a man is assertive, it's okay. But when a woman is assertive, she's called too bossy or in some other way denigrated. When we look at those biases, we need to name them so that women understand and don't take it personally and let it become a roadblock for them. We want to give women opportunities to practice and affirm and teach them how to resist and inform their own sense of self as a leader. Because what we know about combating violence against women is women need to have a role at the table, in the boardroom, in places where they can be part of decision making. And my 30 minutes is up, but I'm going to whip through a couple of these just so you can get an idea for what that might look like.
Sandy, we have you down for another 5 minutes at least, so you're fine before Q&A.
Okay.
So
okay.
You're fine.
All right. Thank you.
We got ahead on our program a bit, so we're good.
Okay. I set my 30-minute timer, so I'm good. All right.
Thanks.
So identifying workspaces. If you've already become a professor, you've already become a leader in your sector, find someone to mentor. Invite them into a coaching relationship. Take them with you and create peer groups. You need some spaces where you can vent, and you don't invite Dave Rice to come, it's just women. But you also need places to practice saying to a man, I don't agree. When I sat with those 10 women, none of them were willing to say to the 2 men in the room that they didn't agree with them. And far be it from them to say you're wrong. And it was after a while, I said, so the problem involves the men as well. How do we change that? And the chair responded, he responded, it will take many generations. So we finally talked about kindergarten and changing how we teach. So one of the research projects that we did at University of Duhok was to evaluate all the primary readers in the prefect. And we just took pictures of the illustrations in the book. And eventually we learned that all of the pictures of women were either holding a baby or dishes. Only one picture had a woman in a professional outfit who was an attorney. Every other picture didn't show women achieving that level of professional expertise. So we have to identify them, give them space, develop those networks, make sure they have access to women's leadership development. My first project in Iraq, I set up a summer internship for a young professor teaching law. It was at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. She was unable to accept that because the family was afraid of ruining her reputation and her chances for marriage. She didn't have access. So when the next promotion came, she didn't have that in her CV, but the young men who could travel abroad for development did. So you begin to see why access is such a big part of empowerment. Access to the boardroom, to the resources, to policy making. Measuring empowerment. Opportunity is a bottom line piece, but without access, there will be no achievement. To help women in that achievement process, we need to support them. And that means making this national urgency. Tell the leaders the why, what's in it for them. Encourage policymakers to make practices for recruiting and hiring women. And that's in our businesses. Again, we have to convince corporate companies that it's in their best interests to hire women. And we've got research now that shows that women improve productivity. We have to help women advance in mid-level positions as well, and practice models that recognize success. We actually have to recognize them, give them awards, cultivate the flowers that you want to grow. I'm like, I see sometimes that when I go to leadership conferences, they use all sports metaphors. So I decided to try to find the middle. I'm not going to use cooking illustrations, but agriculture, men do that too. So cultivate, plant your garden, water it, feed it, protect it from environmental risks. This is the thing that is missing from many women's empowerment programs, how to protect from the environmental risks. To combat human violence against women, we also need to treat them with extra care to empower them. Longfellow said, "We judge ourselves by what we feel capable of doing, while others judge us by what we have already done." There are roadblocks. But
Okay.
together, working together, both men and women, we can make a difference. We can end violence against women. And it's going to take men and women working together, creating access to the opportunities that abound. And we have to measure our progress in combating violence against women with access, resources, and agency instead of saying, well, we built a hospital, but the husbands wouldn't let them come. Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you, Sheila, Sandy. That was terrific. And I know Sheila is going to facilitate now a time of Q&A and discussion. Several of you have entered some questions I see into the chat. And then beyond that, there's a raise hand function that if you want to use, you have a question you'd like to ask directly. So Sheila, I'll turn it over to you.
Sheila, I don't see you on here. Oh, there you are.
She's there, but you're
Okay,
still on
you have to
mute.
unmute, Sheila.
Yeah, you're still on mute there. You just need to click on the.
Got it.
Okay.
One of these days, I'm going to learn how to use this system.
It's okay.
So,
We're all learning.
sorry, Sandy. Okay, so you hear me okay, Sandy?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Okay, so the first question we have here is from Dr. Johnson Katarissa to all of us. And I'm not quite sure where he's from because I don't have that on the question, but here it is. Women in my community have presented, oh, where did it go? Sorry. Women in our community have presented appearance like they are used to talk kinds of violence, early marriage, no access to education, sexual violence, economic violence. Talking to women in the community that they are undergoing violence, they don't believe because violence has been part of their daily life. How do we change that behavior?
Wow, that is such a great question.
Yeah.
I was very surprised when I encountered exactly that mentality in the village outside of Dahok and having a conversation with a group of women. I had an interpreter with me, but their evaluation of what is violence is different than my evaluation. Some things have been normalized. I actually remember, I always look up all of the research I can before I go to a different country. And I was on my way to do training in Zambia, and I looked at their youth health surveys, and I discovered that 57% of girls between the ages of 14 and 18, 57% felt like it was the responsibility of the husband to beat them when they got married. I was like, and so I looked up to see what the boys thought. The boys, only 47% of the boys thought that was a necessary responsibility. But changing culture means we have to introduce them to new models. And yeah. I've heard people talk about how Western media has impacted communities with those kinds of strict shame-based models. And one of the things that I learned when I invited my faculty from University of Dahok to California is that they hadn't learned what I thought they were learning from watching our shows and things like that. What they had learned is that we had no morals, and they thought everybody was like the OC housewives. And so they were pleasantly surprised when they began to meet everyday women who were worried about getting home on time to fix dinner for their family. They thought Western women didn't care about their families. So that's kind of a long way around to answer this question. But I think developing authentic relationships cross-culturally, which I think we can do because of technology, to introduce people so they can see something different and begin to understand that. It also has to come from their husbands. Men need to begin to communicate that they value their wives, that they don't want to beat them, that isn't normal anymore. But it's going to take a long time, generations, to change that feeling. I know those of us who have worked in the area of ending FGM are always shocked when it's the aunt and the mother that arrange, and then the father is furious because he didn't want his daughter to undergo that cutting. So it takes, again, both and, but I do think that we can create opportunities for women to share their experiences cross-culturally. I would love to have a conversation like for a whole hour with you, Dr. Katirisa.
I'm sure it would be an interesting conversation. So there, another question is, Janae, oops, where did she go? Janae Kreitner from Grandma's House of Hope. Do you know her? It
Yes.
sounded like you might. Okay, good, because we've had a lot of conversation with her at Zanta. Her question is I was wondering if you have an opinion about how long an HT transitional housing program should be. There is such a push to run survivors through a housing program quickly, often 4 to 6 months. What type of aftercare do you suggest and for how long?
This is one of the big issues that you mentioned earlier, my work with the public-private partnership, and stable, supportive homes, not just a bed and you have to leave and you can't come back till 7 o'clock at night. That's not a home. We need sustainable, supportive housing that is long-term. And that's a huge gap, and it really contributes to the recidivism that we see, particularly with women who have been commercially sexually exploited, sex trafficking, but also for boys. And that kind of sustainable, supportive housing for boys is hard to come by. There's more. We finally have some in Orange County, but there are no supportive long-term housing programs for human trafficking survivors in Orange County. None.
That is a shame to hear that.
And, you know, if at some point you want to do a workshop on or a coffee on human trafficking, I'd be happy to bring some survivor friends and help put that together.
That would be great, Sandy. Thank you. Okay, we do have another question. It's from Christy Matthews, who's with us in Zanta. She says, what are your thoughts on making change with the hearts and minds versus legislation? For example, the women on boards legislation that was passed in California. In addition to, of course, the needed legislation preventing violence against women, what are your thoughts on legislating giving women additional seats at the table? But of course, you've already spoken to that, but perhaps you might want to embellish a bit.
Well, here's an experience I had back when I was doing my doctoral studies. I read the book Zapotec Women. I recommend it highly because it's like a natural case study. The men in the village accepted, I forget which visa it is, but a work visa, this is back several decades ago, to come to the US to work. So all of the men, because the village was poor, left, almost all, and now the women are in charge. Well, they hadn't been in charge before because the village meetings, leadership meetings, were held during the time when they were the busiest. The kids were home from school, they had to cook dinner, that sort of thing. So when the men left and they had to pick up those responsibilities, they had the meetings at a different time. Oh my goodness. And they started a solutions-based leadership that fit being a mom. They started a business that began to thrive. And when the men came back, there was this tension about, well, now, and this happens a lot to military families here, when he comes back from deployment, then the roles are supposed to switch back to I'm in charge. And the women in the Zapotec village said, no, we have a business we're running. We're making money. Now you don't have to go and live someplace else. So instead of thinking of this in terms of a zero-sum game, here's the pie, and Dave has traditionally had 75% of the pie. And so now we've got more because he was gone. When he comes back, he doesn't want to give anything up. But the problem with zero-sum thinking is that you are limited to that little pie. And actually now, because you're both at the table, the pie is bigger, and we don't have to give up something.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Any other questions? Oh, wait a minute. Here's another Zanshan. Her name is Denise Parrish. I'm not exactly sure what state. Oh, yeah, she's in Wyoming. Okay, good. We've talked a
My
little bit.
dad was born in Wyoming.
Denise is great. She's also on the USA Zanta Caucus with me, as is Betty Hubion. It's a really large not a super large organization, but several women who have so much to offer. And of course, Denise is one of those. So let me ask her question. We're looking at a programs that change social culture by working with high school and junior high boys, prevention programs, and dealing with anger management. Any comments or thoughts?
So I've seen several programs working with boys, and I think that's great. But I do have one caveat. They've got to have practice with girls. So you have to create opportunities for them to work with girls as well. You have to have safe network experience opportunities where the men and the women, the boys and the girls are doing this together. And they need to see that modeled. So when you just bring in men to talk to the boys, it's not enough. We have to have women as well. It's not that slide, either or, is take that home with you, take that idea, because we have to model what we want to have happen. My Vanguard student Live to Free team goes into the high schools, men and women together, and they talk about how young men treat young women. That has to be part of the conversation, but it also has to be part of what we're modeling from a leadership perspective. If you have a team, a man and a woman doing something with high school kids, and he's constantly talking over her and not allowing her the same level of participation, that's more powerful than what's up on the PowerPoint that says treat women with respect, because he just canceled it all out. And it's happened over and over again. And so you can't put the words up on the screen unless you're acting it out in person.
Good point. Very good point. Are there any other questions from our group? Well, I'd like to pose a question to you, Sandy. In the last 6 months, Zanta has been focusing on child marriage in the US, and of course it's expanding. Our group has put together just after Christmas, I think it was, at this point I can't remember, but signs on buses, the OCTD buses, saying child marriage is not okay. And it's becoming, from what I can see, a very large problem for us in Orange County. In some of the research that my colleagues and I have done, it seems to be some of it is religious based, but the other part is women or young girls who have been put out to trafficking or have been kidnapped for whatever reason, and parents who, as you described earlier, in other third world countries, need the money. Are you getting involved in that? Is just some thoughts on where you're going next with it?
Well, I've seen quite a few people, especially here in Orange County, who have stepped up to that, and I'm delighted to see that. It's kind of like I have a plate, and at Thanksgiving I put too much on my plate, and then it starts falling off. So I'm involved. I've done a couple of partnership events with some friends working on this, but it's not become a main issue. It is one form of human trafficking that is widely practiced, and there are a lot of contributing factors. I actually interviewed Diana Mao on the podcast. You might go back and listen to that one, because particularly in the part of the world in rural, remote India, where she has worked and has done work with empowerment models that have opportunity and access. Child marriage is often done by a parent, not because they're bad parents. And I want people to understand this. Sometimes our Western way of thinking is very binary. And if parents did something, we immediately attribute it to being bad parenting. But those mothers married their daughters so that they would not become victims of kidnapping and rape. And when the Syrian war started, I was very connected, still working in Dahok, and went to the refugee camps that because Syria is right there on that border, and wealthy Arabs were coming, and mothers whose husbands had been conscripted into the war, they may or may not even be alive. They had no recourse. They were eager to marry their daughters to someone who would provide a secure livelihood for them. So it was out of a sense of survival, not because they wanted money to get rich. It was about assuring the survival of their children. So again, back to how I started, study the issues before you start making judgments. Cultural traditions, harmful traditional practices, it's actually an area of literature that you can study in lots of different places. And those traditions are hard to break down. And I was, when I first came back from my experience in Iraq, learning about firsthand about honor killings, I was talking to a law enforcement friend of mine, and it's like, oh gosh, I'm so glad we don't have that here. And he goes, well, actually we do. We just don't call it that. But this has happened right here in Orange County, and it's often been associated with particular cultures. And in those communities, it's very covered, and we try not to examine it in that light. So we have Western terminology for homicides that are intimate partner violence, and we often don't include the cultural context.
Yeah, understood. Thank you for responding. Are there any other questions?
Sheila, yes, this is Isabel Tridle. I do have actually two questions. So then the first one, thank you so much, Dr. Sandy, for all this informative session. My first question is regarding the case that you told us about this member from a tribe who came to Vanguard University as his internship, and then he went back to his to the chiefs, and then he started kind of transferring the knowledge that he got from you. So my question is about the follow-up. What is the current situation, and what was the impact like after the program? And then I want to know the current situation.
Yes, well, unfortunately, and this is the thing internationally that we are constantly addressing. You probably know that area returned to conflict, and so the safety of the family, they actually fled to a refugee camp. And so on a personal level, I stay in touch with the young man, and he is educating his daughters, not selling them for cows. He's promoting that, but he has no access to the tribal leaders now because of the violence in the country.
Thank you. And then the second question, um, this is regarding a topic that I kind of find really interesting about what is happening with different institutions and entities that are working to ensure and promote and reduce and educate people about human trafficking. And the question is about partnership. So something that I'm kind of realizing, not just in this field, but in different fields and arenas, is the lack of partnership. And last year, we actually was actually one of the leaders of the UPR, of the Universal Periodic Review that we had here in Southern California. And then we were evaluating the parts of protection, prosecution, and then when we touch base on the partnership, we kind of noticed the lack of partnership because a lot of institutions are still dealing with the grants, like trying to get the resources, trying to get the money, trying to even get the recognition. But I want to know what is your perspective about the current situation in Orange County and also globally about how these different institutions are really working as partners to really reduce this, or do we still find like internal agendas that are kind of diminishing that goal?
Wow. Yeah, we need to have a conversation offline for sure, Isabel. So I do a lot of study of task force collaboration, and a couple of things that I've identified that are lots of other people have also identified is the binary competition versus collaboration. And there is a sense of competition for resources, and this resource scarcity mentality is understandable, and especially now in COVID-19. But there is also a sense that if we stopped and considered the amount of resources that we have, there is enough for everyone. Unfortunately, in the area of human trafficking, people learn about it, become passionate, and then start an NGO. I have a friend who did a kind of a cursory overview a few years ago about nonprofits. And she said there are so many nonprofits that about 85% of the money that's raised goes to overhead, and about 15% gets to survivors. We have too many organizations. At one point, someone offered me the opportunity to start a nonprofit, and I felt like I want to do this from an academic platform so that I can access equally everybody for education and training and all of that. The other thing about partnership is it isn't something that can necessarily, I mean, it is legislated in a lot of our grant. If you can't get a grant if you're not partnering with other community leaders. But we measure collaboration based on three data sets. One is trust, one is respect, and the other is density. And trust is, you know, I know who you are and I trust you, so I'm going to work with you. I don't know who they are, so I'm going to hide my cards and keep my resources over here and not let you know that I've got this. Trust. Respect. Respect is a value for the other person's work. And I'm pretty good at respecting other people. Like I have friends, like we talked about the child marriage, they're doing a great job with that. So why would I try to take one piece of that territory? They're doing a good job. I don't need to. On the other hand, prevention in the high schools is nothing is consistent. It's not based on evidence-based practices, and it's often pretty much like the DARE model, which we know didn't work, which is why we still have an opioid crisis. So trust, value, and respect, and then density. And this is where UPR could be very helpful. We measure what the connections are. So a task force in a community can have really high trust scores, but they only trust 5 people out of 50. So if you can imagine that on a graph, and now you're turning it into a net, a safety net for vulnerable people. If the density is only 5 strands, everything's going to fall through that safety net. But if you have a density score of 50 or 75%, nothing's going to fall through the cracks. You're not going to have high recidivism rates. You're not going to have unemployment for your survivors, that sort of thing. That was a very long answer, Isabel.
Thank you so much.
Okay, are there any more questions? Okay. Dave, I think
Yes.
I'll return it back to you to, let's see, what's on your list?
Yeah, we're just going to do some wrap up. We just have
Okay,
a few
good.
minutes remaining. Talk a few announcements for the UNA and for Zonta. And Sandy, thank you so much for this outstanding presentation. I know everybody has thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm sure we can all, give you the hand wave and the hand clap.
Thank you.
And certainly, many good takeaways. For me, the big takeaway was your comment about both and. I think that, hits home. And I think, from my perspective, as a man approaching, women's groups, women's issues, we're always reluctant. So it's nice to have that invitation, if that's ever required. So that, we always feel like we're sort of balancing that, but I totally agree with you. And I think you gave that same advice to Denise from Wyoming with her outstanding program with boys, working with boys, that there needs to be interaction with girls in that. So anyway, we're so fortunate to have, someone like yourself as a local resource right here in Orange County at a terrific institution like Vanguard, really just in our backyard. And I know we've done some good work with you and the university in the past. As Isabel mentioned, we had a big focus on human trafficking last year, and Vanguard participated in that. So we look forward to continuing that. And so what I just wanted to do real quick for those of you that may not be that familiar with the UNA, the UN Association, just give you the quick overview, and the Council of Organizations, talk about a couple things coming up. So the UN Association is not actually a part of the UN directly. It's a organization of citizens to support the mission and goal of the UN. And we're under an organization called the UN Foundation, which is something that was started by Ted Turner, actually revised by Ted Turner. The UN Association has been around ever since the forming of the UN, but it came in under the UN Foundation with Ted Turner back a ways, and has continued to thrive with another organization called Better World Foundation. One of the main goals of the UN Association, our mantra is to think globally and act locally. So we want to educate our citizens and folks in our communities both on the mission and goals of the UN and what's going on globally, but also apply the concepts locally to our own communities. And so these efforts, these coffee talks, are really an effort to help promote that, which is to take issues that we're having locally in our communities and educate and provide a good forum for discussion around those issues. And to that end, we have an entity called the Council of Organizations. It's actually a UNA USA wide organization, but each chapter a UNA chapter may have their own version. And so in Orange County here, we have a Council of Organizations with about 30 to 40 other nonprofit organizations that are all members. It's a free membership. And Zonta is certainly one of our major ones. Janae was on with Grandma's House of Hope, another outstanding organization. We've got a number of them. And our goal really is to get together, as we were discussing, as Isabel brought up partnerships, it's to help create partnerships with organizations that are interested in all the major issues, whether it's human rights, whether it's health and women's issues, whether it's energy and climate, regardless of what the issue is, to try and work together and be more effective in helping solve the problems in our communities. So that's really the purpose. And in that vein, we then have these coffee talks that we're planning on having, as Sheila mentioned. She and Zonta will be co-sponsoring these with us now throughout 2021. If we're not in the COVID time, we'll be doing these live. And, she's been gracious enough to offer their location. They have a terrific location facility there in Costa Mesa. And so when we're able to get back together live, we'll be doing that. But in the meantime, it's great, as we mentioned, to be able on Zoom to have so many folks participating also from not just our own community, but from frankly around the world. So we'll continue to do that as we move forward. And the place to go to find out the calendar for events is on our website at una-oc.org. I will put that into the chat when I'm done, but you can just go there and see the calendar of events for the Council of Organizations as well as for other events that UNA Orange County is sponsoring. And one event in particular I want to make sure and highlight is a celebration coming up of Human Rights Day. December 10th is International Human Rights Day, and it is the anniversary of the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the core central instrument worldwide to help move things forward in terms of progressing around human rights violations. And so December 10th is the anniversary of that. It was signed in 1948, and we're having a big online Zoom event celebration with some terrific speakers, some entertainment, so that's Thursday night. It'll be 6 to 7:30, and I'll put the registration link also in chat for any of you that would be interested in participating in that. That's also the information is on our website there, and this is a collaboration event, and it should really be a lot of fun. So Sheila.
Okay, just a few statements. December 10th, of course, is also the end of the 16 days of activism that we in Zonta have, and also is a UN project or campaign that was started many years ago. So yes, we are doing quite a bit right now to put information onto our websites, and many of our organizations, our clubs, are sending them out to other organizations, just information about this is what we're doing. So that's good. It all ties together, doesn't it? I do recall that there's a date been set for the COO meeting. I maybe been talking to Joy, but I don't have any notes on it. So I'll leave it with that. Just back to you again, Sandy, is I've read or listened to almost every one of your podcasts, and the one that really, I guess, got my attention last night when I was reading it was about the boys in Thailand and the issues that are going on. I spent a lot of time in Asia working, and in Thailand in particular, and the visibility is there. There's no hiding it. It's there. Okay. And I recognize how difficult it is to overcome something like that. And of course, I was working in a for-profit global corporation, so there was nothing I could do. But I'm going to be following that with your podcast, Sandy. The last statement for me is you had mentioned in the podcast how to succeed, study the issues, be a voice, and make a difference. And I put that down in bold because I'm going to put that on almost all of my emails, and certainly within Zonta. It was great, a great response to, okay, so now what do I do? That's what you do. There were a couple more statements, not questions. This one is from Dr. Keteris again, and he says, it's very instructive. Thank you very much. We must change the approach of helping women in our community in the DCR. Yeah, we wish you much success, Doctor. And then Sandy has put a message on also that says the podcast mentioned are at their website. If you can go to the chat room, you'll see it, but it's basically endinghumantrafficking.org. And then Dave has also put some more information regarding the UNAOC organization. So with that, I think we are finished. Sandy, thank you so very, very much. It is good to see you and listen to you.
Thank
And
you.
you're welcome. And with that, I think we can close up. Yeah, Dave?
Yes, yes, and I'm going to, at this point, I will go ahead and stop the recording. Jaden, I see that you have your hand up, and go ahead and ask that question, and then I'm going to stick around for a few minutes, 10 minutes, for anybody that wants to still have any questions or discussion, if you'd like. Sheila, I don't know if you're able to do that as well, but
Yes, I will. Yeah.
okay, great. So feel free to